Okay, okay. So maybe they lost the best part of the presentation, you know. Okay. And okay, so this is this is typically an alien day meteorites. Okay. Okay, and now and the last thing that I would like to show is that you see here, and I will go back to that. You see all those whitish things that are not roundish. They are called CAIs, and I'm going to go back to them. They are very important to us because those whitish minerals are the oldest mineral of the solar system. So you all know that we say in every textbook that the solar system is 4.56 billion years old. What does this number come from? 4.56 billion years old. It is the age of those minerals that you see here that are called CAIs. Okay. So the different chondrites, there is it's a big family, huh? So okay, there's a big family. You have the carbonaceous, the ordinary, and the unstatite chondrite. And when you see that most of the chondrites are made of, the legend has disappeared, okay, but most of the chondrites are made of ordinary chondrites, okay? It is like the averagely oxidized chondrites. So now if we go in terms of what are the minerals that they contain, so you understood their different composition. So the unstatite are highly reduced. They are dominated by iron metal and unstatite. Unstatite, for those who do not know, it's a kind of, it's a magnesium and silicon bearing mineral. Okay. Ordinary are an average, and carbonaceous, I said, they contain many different things. And what is very, okay, and okay, that's it. Now let's have a look first on the left graph. I know that a lot of you at CAB are interested in the origin of life. So just for reference, I will not go into the detail. I just displayed the carbon contents of the different kinds of meteorites. So from the bottom to the top, you see unstatite chondrite at the bottom. You see this is the carbon contents in weight %. So the unstatite has the lowest carbon contents, okay? And if the chondrites that contain the most carbon are carbonaceous chondrites, and the most primitive class of carbonaceous chondrites that are called CI chondrites. Now, if we go back to the right scale, so the right scale is a very famous graph in cosmochemistry that is called the Urey-Craig diagram. Okay, it has been established in 1953, and they have tried to establish the oxidation level of the chondrites based only on iron. Okay, because iron is, when you cut a chondrite, it's easy to see the iron, okay? It's easy to detect. So on the x-axis, you see the number of moles, but it is normalized by silicon, of oxidized iron. So you count all irons that are linked to an oxygen. So you call that oxidized iron. And the vertical axis, you count all iron that is not bonded to oxygen. And what is interesting is that those diagrams, in this diagram, the three families, they separate very well. So, how does it work? So, no, I will do with the mouse here. Yeah. So you see that in green, the unstatite chondrite, there is no, the iron has seen no oxygen. All iron is completely reduced. It's called iron metal. You see that the ordinary chondrites that are in yellow, in orange, they have like average, I would say, oxidation level. And what is very interesting is that all the carbonaceous chondrites, they are super oxidized. Okay. And you see there is a lot of oxygen. And what you see in addition is a lot of altered minerals. And now I would like to go to talk a little bit about CAIs. So CAIs are those whitish inclusions that I've shown. So CAIs are super important in solar system formation because it is the first mineral that forms. It is the oldest. When you date, it is the oldest. Every time it is the oldest mineral. So what are they done? They are made of. So this is the typical minerals that you find in CAIs. And as you see, they are very rich in calcium, aluminum. And it's interesting because you see that the oldest mineral are those that also condense at the highest temperature. Because those minerals there, it is super refractory. They condense at temperature of 1600 Kelvin, 1700 Kelvin. And so it seems that there is a correlation between the condensation temperature of the minerals in the chondrites and the age of the minerals. Okay, so there comes the idea that maybe when the solar system formed, it was a very hot environment because you see that the oldest minerals are also the most refractory. And okay, this is something that I wanted to say. But now there is a paradox. Let me show you. Alors, I love this table. If you see a mistake in this table, just tell me, okay? So look at the abundance of CI. So I told you that the most volatile meteorites, those that contain the most water, the most hydrogen, okay, are the carbonaceous chondrites. But very strangely, if you look at the CI content, you remember the CI content of the different kinds of family, you see that the carbonaceous chondrites that contains the most volatile elements are also those that contains the CI that are the most refractory elements. So it seems that you have gathered at the same time refractory and volatile elements in the same object. So it seems that maybe they have gathered. How is that possible? You know, how is it possible to form at the same time a refractory object and a volatile object? Okay, so it means that you have different components that have been brought physically to the same place and that to form this chondrite. And it's a mystery, and maybe there are some explanations. Okay, I'm going to dig into this mystery. And now let's talk about presolar grains. We know in meteorites that you have grains. So the most iconic are those silicon carbides. So silicon carbide is silicon plus carbon. Okay, that's super refractory. And we know from their isotopic composition that you see on the right. So I will not jump, okay, but in the center here, this is the sun, okay. So you see that the isotopic composition in a nitrogen and carbon here is completely different from the sun. It is so different from the sun that we think that those silicon carbides, they form around other stars, and they have been preserved into the carbonaceous chondrites. And when you look at their abundance in the different types of chondrites, you see that again, those that are the richest in presolar grains, those that have recorded the most primitive material, again, are the carbonaceous chondrites. So the carbonaceous chondrites, they are a big paradox at themselves. They contain the most processed material, the CIs, but at the same time, the most primitive material. So how is it possible? So now I'm would like to go to try to understand that. I will skip that. Okay, there's no need to read. You just have to listen to me. Okay. So now we want to understand what is the origin of this diversity. And recently, some people think, and me including myself, that maybe transport is maybe the key thing to understand maybe the formation of those chondrites. Transport in the ancestor of the solar system that was the protoplanetary disk. And now I would like to talk a little bit about the protoplanetary disk. So what is a protoplanetary disk? In our current knowledge of the formation of planetary system, so all start from the collapse of a molecular cloud. So you take a molecular cloud. Okay, so it's very cold. Okay, you want to contract through to gravity, but you know you are all physicists here. If you contract through to gravity, the pressure increases, and then no contraction is possible. The only way for a molecular cloud to contract is that it emits efficiently through black body emission its internal energy, then it can collapse. And when it starts to collapse, the material starts to fall to different center. Okay. And so you start to fall, so you have accretion in the center, and then you have a formation of a protostar. And that's it. And then also you have formation of a disk. Alors you have formation of a disk for a very simple reason, in fact. You all know what is called the conservation of angular momentum. So the problem, let's imagine that you have a molecular cloud that is rotating, okay. So you have a budget of angular momentum. So if you collapse, you have to keep this budget of angular momentum. The only problem is that if you put all the material into the center that is the star, you cannot keep the budget of angular momentum. So what happened? The nature finds a solution to the problem, is that you put most of the mass into the star, but to keep the angular momentum, you have to find that will contain the exceeding angular momentum of the system around. This is why we see that most young stars, they have a disk around it. The disk is the place where you store the angular momentum of the system during the collapse. Okay, so it's a kind of simplified view. Those specialized in magnetic field may have some critics, but I would say this is a zero-order interpretation of the formation of a disk around the protostar. So with some colleagues at the Center for Atomic Energy, we have done MHD simulation MHD simulation of molecular cloud collapse. And here you see, so it's hydro simulation with a magnetic field. You see here the progressive formation of a protoplanetary disk. So you see the flow lines, okay? Most of the material goes into the center and form a protostar, and you form a very thick disk because of adiabatic compression, a very thick disk around that is at hydrostatic equilibrium, and that is a so-called protoplanetary disk. And what is really interesting is that you see the time scale. See, here this is a very short simulation. The time scale are too short here. And here, I will show a little animation. I will show a little animation. Okay. So here you see the disk edge on. So this is what is called a adaptive mesh refinement simulation. So we do a big hydro simulation into a cube that is 1 parsec wide. But we have a multi-scale approach. It's a grid-based cause. We have a multi-scale approach where we can zoom in the middle. Okay, it's called adaptive mesh refinement, and we can go down to a resolution of something like 0.1 astronomical units in the center. And so what we find is that you have the molecular cloud that is collapsing to the molecular cloud, and you form the protostar in the middle, and you see a protoplanetary disk that is fed by the molecular cloud that is collapsing onto the disk. It's clear here? So this is the disk edge on. You see the disk from the edge, and this is the disk face on. And you see that in fact, the material does not come homogeneously from all directions. What you see is that because of the presence of the magnetic field, you see that the disk is fed by fingers of material that falls to the disk. Okay, it's a hydrodynamical instability. Yeah. So that's the condition of formation. So now the question, look at the time scale. You see the time scale are the order of 0.1 millions of years. Okay. So to form a protoplanetary disk, in fact, it is super fast compared to the edge of the solar system or to geological scale. Forming a protoplanetary disk is something what 100,000 years only. Interestingly, you remember the sea ice, the older minerals. The sea ice has been produced. We can date the sea ice, okay? And the production ages of sea ice is about 100,000 years, from 10,000 to 100,000 years. So the production age of sea ice is about the same as the formation time scale of a protoplanetary disk. So today, a lot of researchers think that maybe the sea ice are formed during the collapse of the molecular cloud. Okay. So I will skip that. Okay, so now our problem is we would like to simulate in a computer code the formation of the first mineral of the solar system in the context of a protoplanetary disk that is forming. And you see that the system is not isolated. In most of work of protoplanetary disk, including my work and works of many colleagues, we like to take a protoplanetary disk that is like isolated from the universe and that evolved by itself. But you see that in fact the young protoplanetary disk is not isolated at all. It is connected to the collapsing molecular cloud. So if you want to simulate the production and the formation of the first mineral of the solar system, you have to modelize the protoplanetary disk itself, connected to the collapsing cloud. And inside this protoplanetary disk, what we want to do is to try to simulate the condensation of the first solid, okay, and the transport of the first solid, okay. So we cannot do today with MHD simulation because the physics is too big. Because if you want to simulate the formation of the solid, you have to put chemistry. And today there is no MHD code coupled with a chemical network, with a rich chemical network. Okay, so we have simplified the problem. So now I enter in the world of modelization, where everything is spherical, everything is isotropic. Okay, so we have simplified the problem. So I'm going to show you what we have said. Okay. Alors, a lot of people find this graph super confusing. Okay, so I will try to explain what is that. Alors, the red dot is a protostar. Okay. The little butterfly you see, it is a protoplanetary disk seen edge on, okay? And the big spherical shell, gray spherical shell that you see around, it is the collapsing molecular cloud. So we simulate something in 3 components. What we will simulate, it is a protoplanetary disk that is there, okay? And we will simulate that. The collapsing molecular cloud, we will not simulate it. We will consider it what we call a source term. It is an external process that feeds the disk with interstellar material with solar composition. But the thing is that by conservation of angular momentum, you cannot put the interstellar material everywhere where you want in the disk because you must conserve angular momentum. So now, by simple geometrical consideration, let's imagine you have a molecular cloud that is like a sphere that is rotating, that is collapsing, okay? Of course, let's imagine it has the shape of an onion, multi-layers. The inner layers, they have less angular momentum. So less angular momentum means that they will fall close to the star. But the outer layers that have a larger radius, when they fall, intrinsically, they have a larger angular momentum because I remind you that the angular momentum goes like the r square, okay? So the outer layers of the molecular cloud, naturally, they will fall later because they start further, but also they will fall at larger distance from the star. So during the collapse of the molecular cloud, the first region that will be fed will be the inner regions close to the star. And on later time, the regions that will be fed by the molecular cloud are the outer regions because it will be the outer shell of the molecular cloud, simply by angular momentum conservation, okay? Yeah, because in a protoplanetary disk, you are in orbit around the star. And if you do a little bit of celestial mechanics, the angular momentum increases with the distance to the star. So everything that is low angular momentum falls close to the star. Everything that is high angular momentum falls far from the star. Okay. So we introduce the concept of what is called centrifugal radius. So, and this is a beautiful work of a Spanish collaborator that some of you may know, called Ricardo Hueso. And so here you see the time. Alors, you see the time. This is time. Alors, there are many things, hein, okay. But here you have to look at this curve here, and you look at this scale. So this curve is called the centrifugal radius. Alors, so it tells you that at short time, it gives you on the y-axis, it gives you the distance at which the interstellar material falls. So initially, the interstellar material falls close to the star. You see, about like 0.5 AU, okay? But as time increases, the centrifugal radius increase, okay? And after something like 100,000 years, the material can fall up to 10 AU from the star, okay? Is that clear? So the centrifugal radius is the region inside which the molecular cloud material falls, and this region increases with time, okay? So now what we want to do, we build a model. What we want to do, I will skip that. We want to build a model where we simulate the protoplanetary disk that is in blue, that is in 1D, that will be fed by the molecular cloud as a source term, that is the yellow arrow and the green arrow. And inside the protoplanetary disk, we will simulate the transport of the material. Is that clear? Okay. But now the protoplanetary disk itself, it's a very complex structure. And I'm going to talk about the protoplanetary disk. The protoplanetary disk is typically described as a disk of solar gas that is at hydrostatic equilibrium. And in this disk, it's a very old debate in astrophysics, but we have good reason to think that neutral material is not turbulent, because you can show that in this kind of flow, there is the turbulence does not develop in neutral material. But we have discovered by the end of the 90s that in fact, there are some regions where the material is not neutral, it is ionized for very simple reason. Close to the star, you have thermal ionization, okay? Close to the star, you have thermal ionization. And far from the star, in low density region, you are also ionized, but because of cosmic rays. And it has been discovered by around the 92, 93, that when you have a little bit of ionization, the coupling with the magnetic field creates a very powerful very powerful instability that creates a lot of turbulence. And that is called the magneto-rotational instability. And you can show that very small ionization level, the material becomes very turbulent. So it means that close to the star and far from the star, the disk is very turbulent. But in the middle, where you do not have thermal ionization or ionization by cosmic ray, the flow is laminar. And these kind of regions are called dead zones. So the disk is turbulence dead in the middle, but active, turbulence active close to the star and far from the star. And it has a lot of implication on the disk evolution. Why? Because the first effect of turbulence will be by you will diffuse material much more efficiently, okay? Because of the vortex, the diffusion in the disk will be very efficient. So you expect that here and there, the material with the disk will spread and will diffuse very efficiently because of high level of turbulence. But also it has an effect on the thermal balance of the disk. Because of this, so you know, this turbulence creates a kind of effective viscosity. This turbulence has an effect because you have shock wave in turbulence, you compress the gas, so you heat up the system. So in fact, the turbulence creates, you have turbulence heat, you have viscous heating of the system, okay? So close to the star, the disk is not only hot because it is heated by the star. Close to the star, the disk is also very hot because it is viscously heated. It is viscously heated. So now I will, so now how to put all this physics in disk model? Alors, we know in astrophysics, we are very good to find very useful cooking recipe because you cannot put, it's very difficult to put all that physics in a simple model. So what is super popular in planetary science, in solar system formation, it is called alpha disk model. So what is alpha disk model? Alpha disk model, the idea is that, okay, if you want to simulate the disk evolution for a few million years, it's not possible to take into account precisely all those mechanisms. So there is a very common simplification that is used by many persons. It's a kind of simplification of the system is that you will put a fake, what is called an effect, you will put a fake viscosity in the system that will absorb all the effect of turbulence, that at the same time will simulate the diffusion processes, and at the same time will simulate the heating processes, okay? And this model is called the alpha viscosity model. So you introduce a kind of fake viscosity that is fake. It's called effective viscosity. Okay, it's called a subgrid model. In fact, it's a subgrid model. It's a subgrid model where you say that the effective viscosity scales with the sound velocity of the gas divided by the angular velocity around the sun. Omega is the angular velocity around the sun, and so there is a proportionality factor, and this proportionality factor is called alpha. So where you have the name alpha disk model. And alpha is a kind of measure of the turbulence. When alpha is 0, you have a laminar disk. And when alpha is equal to 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 1, you have a very active turbulence. Okay? And now the question is, how do you derive the value of alpha? So to do that, you do first, you do a real compressible MHD simulation where you simulate the turbulence for a few orbits because it's very computer demanding. And you directly measure the value of alpha in numerical simulation, okay? And alpha is of the order of the velocity fluctuation divided by the sound velocity of the system, okay? You see that? So this kind of model, so it's very simplified, but the advantage of those models is that you can compute very fast. And since the model is simpler, you can put a lot of physics, of additional physics. And what we have done, so we have put a kind of chemistry model. So now I will show you. So if you want to do real chemistry, the first thing to do is to introduce what is called equilibrium chemistry. So here I show you, you take a gas of solar composition. So you take the composition of the gas of the sun, okay? So it's a hydrogen, helium, and oxygen, carbon, silicon, magnesium, helium, blah, 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 down to the last element. And if you assume equilibrium chemistry, you can compute for different temperatures what are the minerals that are condensed, And it's very, well, it's not very new. It has been done since the 70s. It is called the equilibrium condensation sequence. So for example, if you condense this gas, so at 1700 Kelvin, the first mineral to condense are like ebonite, grossite, perovskite. And these minerals that you see on the left, on the right, are typical minerals that we find in sea ice, for example. As you lower the temperature, then other minerals condense. So you can see, then you will condense iron, for example. Then after, you will condense silicate-rich mineral like phosphatite and statite. And if you go to lower and lower temperatures, then you will condense moderately volatile elements like sulfur, like sodium, potassium, all that. Alors, in our first attempt, we wanted to plug this chemical network, or this equilibrium chemical network, but in fact, it was too computer demanding. Okay. So what we have done, we have simplified again the problem, and we have simplified the process by saying, okay, so let's take the gas, and now we will just, what you see here is that the transition between the different minerals are very sharp. You see all those vertical lines? The transitions are very sharp. So what we have done, we have just coded the transition. We say, okay, at this temperature, the material goes from that mineral to that mineral. At that temperature, it goes from this mineral to that minerals. And so we have done a table. So you can you can read the different details here, but you see that you condense the different phases of the chondrites at some threshold temperature that we have determined from the previous simulation. Okay. So it's not really a chemical network, but it's a kind of table, a lookup table where we try to copy what we find from equilibrium condensation simulation. And now I will jump. So now let's go to the results. So now what's happened? You have the molecular cloud that is condensing, and what happened to the system? So I'm going to show now the results. So the first thing I would like to show you is that how evolves the temperature of the system. So here you have the temperature. So where is my mouse? Okay, here you have the temperature as a distance, and this is at 4 different times: 40,000 years, 100,000 years, 200,000 years, 1.5 million years. So you see that initially the disk is very close, very hot, close to the star. Okay. Sorry, I have a problem with the. But you see on the upper left, it's very hot, close to the star, and very cold, far from the star. And in blue, I have plotted the centrifugal radius. Okay. So, for example, initially here, all the material falls inside the blue line. So it means that all the interstellar material falls in a system with temperature is above 2000 Kelvin. At 2000 Kelvin, all the interstellar material is lost. It's vaporized. Okay, but as time increases, the centrifugal radius increase here, and the interstellar material fall into regions of lower and lower temperature. So as time increases, the interstellar material can survive and will form different minerals. So there is an interplay between the location where the interstellar material falls and the current temperature. So initially you lose when I say you lose, you're not losing, you're vaporizing everything. But as time increases, you can keep lower and lower temperature dust. Okay? So all that is summarized in this figure. Okay, I will show you this figure. No, this figure is too complex. So I show this figure here. So here you have time. This black line is the centrifugal radius. So all interstellar material falls here. Okay. So the centrifugal radius increases. And in gray, you see the edge of the protoplanetary disk, the disk outer edge. So why is the outer edge of the protoplanetary disk increasing? Simply because of viscosity. The disk is spreading. So initially, you have a very compact disk, and the disk is spreading outward very efficiently. Okay. And in dark gray, you see the dead zone. So in the dead zone here, you have no turbulence in this dead region here. And the material here can be preserved because there is no viscosity. So every material that goes into the dead zone, there is no, the diffusion coefficient falls to 0. So you can store a lot of material in the dead zone. Okay? So now I can jump here. It is the same graph, but here what I have put, it is the vaporization temperature of the different minerals. So here, this is the vaporization temperature of iron, silicate, and water in blue. So initially, that all materials fall inside the vaporization temperature of iron, everything is vaporized. And after 100,000 years, materials can fall beyond the vaporization temperature of silicates, so you can preserve silicates. And on very, very long time, you can even preserve water, interstellar water, and interstellar. This is moderately volatile element here. Interstellar, moderately volatile element. You see the idea? So this is the driving process. So now the question, what is the radial distribution of the different elements in the disk? I'm going to show you a graph. And okay, so I show you very, very initially. This is the distance from the star. This is the distance from the star. And here you see the distribution of CAIs in, we will concentrate on the violet thing on CAIs, okay? So, and here the centrifugal radius is about here. And here it's very interesting. You have CAIs that in violet up to 20 astronomical units very early. But they have been formed at 1700 Kelvin. So they have been formed here. So why do they extend so far? For a very simple reason, is that the disk is expanding very rapidly. So I would say the CAIs, they form in the oven close to the star where it's very hot, but they are transported outward very rapidly because initially the disk is so compact that the viscous expansion of the disk takes everything and transports everything outward. So we fall in a very paradoxical situation when the materials that form close to the star very early is initially transported outward super rapidly because of the very fast initial viscous expansion of the disk. Okay, so you have a lot of CIs in the outer solar system. Okay, simply because everything expanded outward very rapidly. As time increases, then now lower temperature material can survive because this temperature is falling down, and because you have bigger temperature, bigger region of the disk that are fed by the molecular cloud. And you see that in the middle of the disk now, the CI relative abundance is falling. Why? Because it is replaced by other kind of minerals that can survive lower temperature. Okay, so here you see what is called so it's replaced by silicates that now become the most abundant material because the disk is cold enough so that silicon can survive in the dead zone. Okay, and also it's replaced by what we call an processed material. It is heated silicates. And unprocessed, what we call unprocessed, it is pre-solar grades. It is not processed material at all. It is material that has not been heated at all. And at the end, we finish in a situation like that, where CAIs are not abundant at all in the middle of the solar system, but where the CAIs are the most abundant are the outer solar system, completely at the opposite where they have been formed. Okay. And at the same time, you see that the CIs are there. And at the same time, the most abundant material, it is unprocessed interstellar material. So all that is very simple simulation. But now if you want to write a paper and to try to interpret your results, you say, okay, it's very interesting because the region where I have at the same time the most of CIs and the most of unprocessed interstellar material, it is the outer region here. And you want, I do not say the match is perfect, but it's a good indication that it's a good place to form carbonaceous chondrites there, where you have at the same time a mix of low temperature and high temperature minerals. Okay? And that's it. So I will stop here on transport. So it seems that maybe transport of dust in the disk, very early transport of the disk, may potentially explain why you have this strange mix of minerals in the different families of chondrites. And our best match, it is for the carbonaceous chondrites. But now I would like to go to another, before in the last maybe 5-10 minutes, I would like to finish on on something that is related. Now I will not finish on transport. I will like to talk a little bit about non-equilibrium thermodynamics, because I have to say to you, oh, we have taken the equilibrium chemistry model and we have simplified it by transition temperature. But now, and you know, in cosmochemistry, the concept of equilibrium chemistry is really the tool that is the most used in cosmochemistry to understand the mineral formation. But the problem is that it's not clear at all if really equilibrium chemistry is really what happened in the early solar system. So the question is how to go beyond equilibrium chemistry. Okay. So why equilibrium chemistry is so popular? Equilibrium chemistry is so popular because if you compute the equilibrium condensation of minerals, so I'm going to show you that here, there is a concept that is super popular in cosmochemistry for those who study meteorites. It is a concept of condensation sequence. This is what I've shown you before. So you take a gas of solar composition and you compute at different temperature what is the most stable mineral that form. So there is no concept of kinetics or whatever. You just compute the most thermodynamically stable mineral assemblage. And if you do this computation, this is what I've shown you. At high temperature, you form corundum, ebonite, galenite. Those are typically minerals that you find in sea ice. Okay, so you say, oh, wonderful, it works for sea ice. And at lower temperature, you find other phases. Iron nickel, anstatite, forsterite. And this is more or less what you see in anstatite chondrites. But the only problem is that the equilibrium condensation sequence does not work so bad for anstatite chondrites, but it does not explain at all what you see in ordinary chondrites, and it does not explain at all what you see in carbonaceous chondrites. Okay. In particular, there is no phyllosilicates here. Okay. So what we do in cosmochemistry, we say, okay, but maybe there are other processes that are not equilibrium chemistry that are acting. Maybe you have water alteration on asteroids that have maybe formed the phyllosilicates. Maybe some other processes, interaction with the sodium gas, maybe have helped to form the chondrules, blah, blah, blah. Enfin, you have to invoke a lot of different processes. But it is the standard tool that we all use. The only thing is that, is it really true that equilibrium chemistry is really a good assumption? In fact, you know, it's like in many fields in science, sometimes you use something that you know it does not work, but you can compute it, so you still use it, okay? So this is what we do with equilibrium condensation sequence. But if you look at simply, if you do like time scale consideration, you see very rapidly that it may not work everywhere in the disk. So here I have taken a collapsing molecular cloud, okay? And I have compared two time scale. I compare what is called the free fall time scale. It is like a typical time scale, okay, of falling to the sun. So it gives you during a fall to the sun, you cross all the disk temperature and pressure scale, okay. And I have compared another time scale that is the time to equilibrate a mineral with the surrounding gas, okay. So this is the time to exchange its own mass with the gas. So here on the x-axis, the distance to the star. On the y-axis, it is the time to equilibrate 1 or 10 micron mineral with the gas. And you see that close to the star, be inside 0.5 AU, the free fall time is longer than the time to equilibrate a mineral with the gas. So it means that maybe you are in the right condition for equilibrium chemistry. But as you go below 1 IU, you see that the time to equilibrate a mineral with the gas diverge to crazy numbers. Above, it is the age of the universe, okay? So for example, at 1 IU, it takes about the age of the universe to equilibrate an iron grain with the gas, okay? Okay? What is called a minimum mass solar nebula. And here you see the free fall time. So in all this region, maybe the assumption of equilibrium chemistry is not good. I give you an example. Let's take a piece of sea ice, of aluminum. I take a piece of aluminum, I put it on this table. Is it at equilibrium? No, it's not at equilibrium. in fact, you can compute that aluminum is not at all at equilibrium with the atmosphere of the air atmosphere. It's evaporating, but the evaporation timescale is so long that it's unmeasurable. Okay, but thermodynamically speaking, it's not at equilibrium. Okay, because it is not in contact with the saturating vapor pressure of aluminum that it would need to be at equilibrium. Okay, but in the classical condensation sequence, this is the calculation that is done. In the equilibrium condensation sequence, it will tell you that aluminum cannot exist on this table simply because it's not at equilibrium with above vapor. So you will not see the existence of this aluminum. So what we have developed, and it's in review, we have developed a new approach that we try to compute kinetics of evaporation of condensation. So we do non-equilibrium condensation and evaporation. So I will not go much into details, but I will give you like the essence of this approach. Okay. So the idea is that we simplify the problem. We take a closed system, so we maintain the pressure constants. And now, if you want to track evaporation condensation, you cannot apply the Gibbs energy minimization anymore, because in the Gibbs energy minimization, you have no idea of the reaction. You just say, you can just compute what is the most stable phase, but you have no idea of what are the reactions that leads to this most stable phase. It just tell you, okay, by some process, blam, this is the most stable phase, but you have no idea. If you know now chemistry kinetics, you have to consider individually all reactions. So we have split the problem into two types of reaction because they have two different formalisms. You have what is called, on the left, condensation and evaporation reaction. And there is a formalism that is called the Hertz-Snuxen law. So maybe you know that. I can go into details. So basically, the Hertz-Snuxen gives you the rate of evaporation of condensation if you take a mineral in contact with a gas. Okay. And we consider also other type of reaction that is called nebular reaction, is that you take a mineral that interacts with the gas, and you can have exchange of atoms between the mineral and the gas, and you can compute the rate of that by applying the thermodynamics law, so the law of kinetic chemistry. Okay. And we are in a situation where our knowledge is very unbalanced. We know quite well everything we need on the left, quite well, within an order of magnitudes, because you have a lot of thermodynamical tables that are available for a lot of mineral. So maybe you have heard of that, like the Janaf table or blah, blah, blah. Maybe you have a lot of data on that. But the problem is that the kinetic of those reactions on the right, interaction of a mineral with a gas, are very difficult to measure. And we have only a very few data. So what is interesting is that, so we have coded more or less everything on the left, and on the right, we have taken in the literature all the kinetic constants that was measured, and there was not so many. And for all the other one, we have put some constant values, okay? Saying, okay, and we have explored like fast reaction or flow reaction. So now I'm going to show you the effect of kinetics. So what is the effect of kinetics? The question is, do we condense the same mineral if we take a gas that we cool fast or we cool slowly? That is the big question. So let's try something that is first close to equilibrium chemistry, that let's imagine we condense fast. No, sorry. No, we condense slow. If we condense slowly, we may be closer to equilibrium chemistry. So now I'm going to show you something with a lot of colors. So, okay, so here, where is my mouse? I'm going, okay, my mouse, oh, the mouse, it is here, wonderful. So, okay, so here, this is the temperature of condensation. This is the mass fraction, and the different colors are the different minerals, okay? So you have 1 minute to learn by heart all the legend, okay? So, no, it's a joke, I know it by heart, okay? So first, and this is, so here I take a gas at 10 to the minus 3 bar, and I condense in 1,000 years, something impossible to do in a laboratory. It takes 1,000 years to condense the gas. So first I form corindum, then I form ebonite, that is in pink, grossite, galenite. And if you look at to equilibrium condensation on the right, I recover equilibrium condensation. We have more or less the same minerals. There are some differences, but we are more or less the same minerals. And then we go to lower temperature. In violet, I have iron, metal, fosterite, and statite. And we recover iron, and statite, and fosterite is here. And when we go to lower temperature, it's not calculated on the right. You will recover more or less the same mineral as equilibrium condensation sequence. So when we do kinetics very slow, we recover something that is quite close to equilibrium condensation sequence. And it looks like more or less, it's not very far from an unstatite object. At least you see it's unstatite rich. But the big surprise is that what happens now when you condense super fast. Alors, you just look at that. It is the same system, but you condense not in 1,000 years. You condense the system in 0.1 year, like in 1 month. Alors, just by looking at the color, you see that we do not have the same colors. So what do we have? At high temperature, you have corindum, habonite, grossite. You have CRI-like material. So it starts like a classical condensation sequence. And when you go to lower temperature, you have many minerals that form. And you know, almost no iron metal. Iron metal is like a few %. And all the iron now is in oxidized form. Pyalite is this oxidized iron. You have magnetite also, that is oxidized magnesium. And you have also a lot of phyllosilicates that appear just by the simple effect of fast condensation. So it's completely out of equilibrium condensation. So how to explain that? Okay. So it seems that all those minerals, in fact, are very oxidized. And how to explain that? In fact, it's not very difficult to explain. You have to look at what is called the supersaturation of the different gases. You take a gas. Let's say, for example, consider iron or calcium or aluminum. If you condense slowly, aluminum have all times it wants to form corundum or to form high temperature minerals. Okay. So when you go to 4,000 Kelvin, all the aluminum has been used to form high temperature mineral. And there is no aluminum available anymore to form lower temperature mineral because everything has been consumed at high temperature, even for iron. Iron wants to form first iron metal. If you spend 1,000 years living all the time for iron to condense, okay, the irons want to form iron metal. But now if you force the system, if you say, oh, you do not have 1,000 years to condense, you have 0.1 year to condense, then you lower the temperature so fast, then aluminum has no time to go in the most stable form at high temperature. And then, for example, when you go to lower temperature, you start to supersaturate all the lower temperature mineral very rapidly. So part of the iron will go in iron metal. But the time it takes to go in iron metal is so long that the temperature has lowered so fast that now other mineral can form at lower temperature. In fact, you do not give enough time for the different atoms to go in their most stable form. So the atoms, they are surprised in some sense, and they try to combine with what they can with the most abundant species that there is around them. And what is the most abundant species that is around them? It is oxygen. So they combine with oxygen, and you form oxidized form rapidly at lower temperature. And I will stop here, more or less. No, I will just show you one last thing. Now what we have done here, you know, in France, we have very good eyes. We can see all the different legends and the different colors. So it's a joke, okay? We have explored the effect of condensation time, short to long condensation time, and the effect of pressure. So for example, at high pressure, high temperature, you have this condensation sequence. At low pressure and low pressure and short and very short condensation, you have this condensation sequence. And just even if you do not know what is the meaning of the color, just by eyes, you see that in fact, you have two regions that clearly appear. You have an upper triangle that is here, where all the mineralogies are the same. And you have a lower triangle where all the mineralogies are the same. What we discover is that even if you change the pressure and condensation time, you do not have a continuity of different mineralogy. Only two big mineralogy appear. And if you look into the details, On the upper right, you have always a very reduced mineralogy. On the lower left, you have a very oxidized mineralogy, and you have on your diagonal a kind of intermediate mineralogy. So you have only 3 mineralogies that appear. So now it starts to be very tempting. I do not say it's true, but it starts to be very tempting to see, do we have a link between the 3 different types of chondrites and those 3 mineralogy we found by numerical simulation. So what we have computed, it is the effective FO2. It is the FO2, it is the amount of oxygen in the system. What is the effective FO2 of the rocks? And what we have found, first, here you have to see that here, okay, I would just like to insist on that. All those minerals, they form exactly in the same environment. The only difference, it is the rapidity of condensation. And here we are at equilibrium with the gas, so very reduced. But here, when we have fast condensation, we are not at equilibrium with the gas. So the FO2 in the mineral is completely different from the FO2 in the gas because you are out of equilibrium. Then, so the type A, it is on the it is the reduced one, and the type C, it is the oxidized one. So in cosmochemistry, we have a scale of oxidation that is called the iron-Wurtzit buffer. And so we measure the oxidation compared to the iron-Wurtzit buffer that is called delta UW. So the type A, we are -4 to -6 logs Lunix compared to the iron-Wurtzit buffer. So it means that we are very reduced. And it matches quite not badly the average oxidation state of the unstatized chondrites. For the type C, the most oxidized, we have iron-Wurtzit buffer around 0. It means that it's quite oxidized, okay? And it matches quite well in fact, the carbonaceous chondrites. And we have an intermediate state that may be quite close to the ordinary chondrites. And at the end, if we put that in the iron oxidation state, we found that all our numerical unstatized chondrites, they fall here, quite close to what is measured in the solar system. All our type C, they fall here. And in fact, we are quite close to the CV and CO chondrites in the solar system. But we never match the CM and CI chondrites of the solar system. And our type B chondrite is not very far from the oxidation state of the ordinary chondrites. So what we propose here is that maybe the different oxidation states of the chondrites of the solar system. Maybe it can be due to different oxidation environments, but what we propose here is maybe an alternative explanation. Maybe it's not a replacement of the previous one. Maybe it just tell you the degree of disequilibrium of the condensation process. So it does not explain everything, but it's a new way to think about the oxidation of the chondrites of the solar system. Okay, and I would say so it's an additional way. Okay, and so it does not say that the previous assumptions were bad. For example, we see a lot of phyllosilicates in carbonaceous chondrites that are associated to water flow. We do not say this does not exist, but we say you can form also some phyllosilicates by rapid condensation. Okay, and I will finish here. So kinetics effect may be very important in the formation of chondrites in the solar system. We find that even if you turn all the parameters, you have only 3 mineralogies that appear. That is tempting to associate to the 3 mineralogy of the chondrites. And maybe the different oxidation states of the chondrites, they can tell you something about the disequilibrium state of the condensation progress in the solar system. And it opens new way to interpret, in fact, the formation of chondrites. And I have finished here. And sorry, I was a little bit long. And I thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Sebastian. Does anyone have questions?
Hi. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have 2 questions, so I will be brief. I don't really understand why the galactic cosmic rays don't reach the middle parts of the protoplanetary disk. I see why the solar radiation does, but how is that part protected?
Alors, in the middle of the solar, let's say from 1 to 10 IU, for example, it is protected because the temperature drops, okay, and then you can form a lot of dust. And you can form macroscopic dust. In fact, in the dust-rich environment, dust is a very big number of atoms, okay? So the galactic cosmic ray, they hit the dust, they can destroy they can destroy dust, okay? But what happened is that the environment is so dusty that the inner region, I'm talking about the midplane, and the midplane of the protoplanetary disk is protected by dust.
Okay, it's like shielded. Okay, thanks. And my other question was, the alpha viscosity model is widely used in. So does this model always account for these dead zones in the middle, or it doesn't?
Alors, it depends on the author, okay? It depends on what you want to do, okay?
Okay.
Okay, if you do what we call first principle simulation, so you take what is called you couple. So, okay, so it's complex. You take the Euler equation for the gas, you take the Maxwell equation for the magnetic field, and you take also what is called you have a chemical network for the production of dust that is called non-ideal MHD. So what you see in general is that alpha varies. You have a big variation of alpha with the distance to the star. Alpha is high close to the star, alpha is far from the star, and alpha is low in the middle. But in a lot of work, because sometimes the problem is too complex, in a lot of work, a lot of people, sometimes to study basic processes, they use constant values of alpha. So you have a lot of work, they say, okay, we assume the disk is laminar, so alpha equal 10 to the minus 4. Or we assume that the disk is very turbulent, alpha equal 10 to the minus 1. When you do MHD simulation, you see that alpha varies a lot with distance. The only problem is that with MHD simulation, you cannot simulate 1 million years evolution. You can only simulate like 10 years or maybe 100 years at most. So when you want to study long-term evolution of the disk, as we do here, we cannot use MHD simulation.
Single value.
Yeah. So we talk those. It's like a toy model, but it's very used. Yeah, it's very, very used.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions?
In these models, what would be the effect of disk winds, which I guess they also affect the transport?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Alors, the effect of disk wings. Where are these wings? Okay, the effect of disk winds. So in MHD simulation, we see. So what are disk winds for those that are not familiar? Is that what we see in MHD? It's a first principle simulation of disk. It thinks that the magnetic field is threading the disk vertically, and you have a coupling between the upper layers on the disk and the midplane. And what we see is that the upper layers of the disk tends to go away from the star. But by conservation of angular momentum, you torque the disk, and the disk is pushed inward to the star. Okay. And these wings, as we know them today, they cannot be very well simulated by the alpha disk model, because alpha just likes like a viscosity, you spread in every direction. This wing, you have a preferred direction, you torque everything to go inward. So the effect of this wing would be that maybe the disk would not spread so efficiently as I have presented here. But the question is that this wing only acts on the very upper layers of the disk, because the disk has to be to have this wing, the material that goes in the wing, it is a fully ionized material. So I would say that maybe initially this wing does not play a big role, because only comparatively to the bulk of the disk, it just acts on a very, very small portion of the system. But on long term, when the disk is very spreaded, okay, the fraction of material that will go into the wing becomes significant compared to the total volume of the total mass of the system. So on long term, maybe this wing may efficiently act to provoke accretion onto the star. So yeah, this is clearly a problem here, but disk wing, alpha disk model today. So a lot of people try to find a kind of tweaking the alpha prescription to try to simulate disk wing. But as far as I know, there is no very clear model for now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? I have a short question, more a curiosity. The data that we are getting from the missions from different asteroids is helping to validate these results, or you
Of
can
course.
somehow compare? Because I guess not, because
Of course, it's fully validated. No, I'm joking. No. Okay. So what I know, if you look at here. So, but I do not have graph here. Okay. You know about condensation? You're talking about condensation. So what I know is that, for example, something that we do not reproduce here, you see that here, this is the oxidation level of Ci and Cm. Okay, we never reproduce that. But recently, I know some people, okay, that have presented in a conference the oxidation state of the Ryugu of the Hayabusa 2 mission. And that is very close to Ci chondrite. So maybe you're aware of that. It's very, when you sample Ryugu, in fact, it's a Ci chondrite, more or less. It's very close to Ci chondrite. And they do not recover this point that you have in the literature. They find a point that is much closer to Cv and Co. And for us, it's good because we say we never get this point. So what they say is that maybe the oxidation state of Ci is maybe an artifact of meteorites that has stayed at the Earth surface, that has oxidized at the surface of Earth. So it has been presented in conference at the Meteoritical Society last year and more recently. So it goes in the good direction. Other point that is interesting is that about phyllosilicates. So you have a wide literature in cosmochemistry that demonstrates that phyllosilicates are really the result of water flowing on asteroids, asteroidal alteration. Okay. And but there are some cases where sorry, I do not have a picture. It's somewhere in another presentation. In some cases, you have very different things. On Ryugu, for example, you have some microscopic electronic images where you see altered phyllosilicates everywhere, and in the center, you see, like for example, you see a very detailed crystal of phospherite with no water alteration. And it has been seen also on some other meteorites on Earth. So for example, when you see a very fine-grained mineral not altered by water in an ocean of phyllosilicates, in that case, for example, this could be a sign. For example, this could be a hint of phyllosilicates condensation. And there is also another thing that I have not shown because of lack of time. We have studied also, you know, one of the characteristics of the unstatite chondrites is that they are said to be super reduced, not only because they are because the iron is devoid of oxygen, but there is something very strange in the unstatite chondrite. It's what is called the sulfidation. Unstatite chondrites are rich in sulfur. Okay, so you see that iron is bound to sulfur, and you see that calcium is a very high temperature. You condense calcium at 2000 Kelvin or 18,000 Kelvin. Calcium is bound to sulfur. That is a moderately volatile element. And in our calculation, what we found, I've not shown it, that in fact, you can trap sulfur in calcium and in iron when you condense rapidly. So we have submitted all that to Nature, and we are waiting for the review. So, but again, I do not say that all the previous models are bad. It's a different interpretation that is interesting to consider. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And if we don't have any more questions, not either in the Zoom. So thank you very much. And
thank you. Thank you for organizing. I hope it was not too complex.
No, a little bit for me, but I think some people really appreciate it.
Okay, I try to cover many different things. Hello.
It was a very generous seminar. I'm also organizing the seminar with Antonio.
Okay, nice to meet you. Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah.